So, welcome to another solo show. I'm actually collating a number of articles blogs and stuff that I'd written, and I'm going to be producing a book about, sort of being creative, but taking it from either, it depends on how you look at it, either a NLP perspective or a magical thinking perspective. I was going to talk today about mapping a journey. I did a little podcast a little while ago about maps, because one of the lines of thinking that I have creatively is that our interface with reality is a form of a map, whether that's with music, scales and chords, structures, etc. Because really, if you think about music, it's rather ethereal, and somebody chose the pitches, and somebody named them, and somebody created scales, and somebody created chords. And if you listen to sounds within nature, and they are, I suppose in a way you could call them symphonic. If you listen to nature without any human interaction, no sounds of cars and aeroplanes, which is actually really difficult to avoid nowadays, particularly if you live in the UK, but seemingly there's very few places that you can go that you can avoid any sound from outside. Anyway, the point that I'm getting at is if you sit and listen to nature, it has got that sort of incredible symphonic sound, you know, the sound of bees and birds and the wind blowing through the trees and all the rest of it. But of course, if you analysed it, it's absolutely chaotic. So the order that we have created, that we can call music, comes from this sort of mapping. So anyway, let's start with this idea. So I've mixed this up with the thing of NLP Timelines and a number of other things. So the thing is, before we start a journey, of course, we need to know where we're going, and what is our direction. And of course, we do need a direction in order to arrive at a place that we've chosen, obviously. So the first thing is, where are we starting from? Now, at some point in the past, our ancestors named the directions, you know, north, south, east, west. Directionality eventually sort of became unified and standardized. Now, there are some cultures that don't have that. Well, perhaps not so much now, but not very long ago. Everything would have been referred, you know, there would have been referenced to maybe the mountain or the river or the sea. So your position would have been referenced to that. So as a thought experiment, which is the best way to look at these things, there was a time before the directions were named, and someone made a magical decision to invoke directionality. And then later created, within 2 dimensions, a drawing. So we've got then the idea of symbolism of items, in the landscape, the tree, the hill, the river, etc. And then eventually, of course, this drawing creates, you have effectively some sort of power over the landscape, because you can then direct yourself and others to things because of this symbolism. So in other words, a map was created. Now, NLP timelines, let's talk about this. So within neuro-linguistic programming, which is obviously what NLP stands for, the process of timelines was this thing of being able to see into the future and into the past, and to locate within that how we could go back in time to fix something that happened. So we could change our psychological relationship to an event in the past. And going into the future to plan the events that needed to happen for you to achieve the goal. So this process was developed by a guy called Tad James. I'm assuming it's a guy in the 1980s. And he used the concept to store memories in a linear fashion. Now, what interests me about this is not that dissimilar from what the Greeks did with having the memory palace, where you would walk around a building and you would place important things in locations on the journey. Now, if you go back to the time of the Greeks, obviously it was difficult to write things down. It would have been expensive. So it was easy to remember things. And we forget that the human capacity for memory is astonishing. So I remember hearing from Satish Kumar, who, when he was young, he was a Jain monk, and he memorised, I think it was 10,000 sutras, mantras, verses, which, even if it was only one word, 10,000 is a lot. So that's pretty amazing, and I think that was common for people. So the idea that somebody like Homer, whether he existed or not, but the storytellers of the past had many, many stories that were deeply complex. So, memory, we're going to talk about the Greek system a bit later. But what interests me is when you start mixing these techniques with other things. So, for instance, from the sort of shamanic perspective, shamanic journey, which is, if we go in from the psychological perspective, we can call active imagination a sort of Jungian thing. Now, people will argue that there's a difference, but let's say that there isn't for the time being. Let's say that there is a way that creative imagining could augment what you do with the thing of a timeline, NLP timeline. A couple of other things that you could do. I dowse. It's one of the little things that I've sort of done it throughout the years. Good for finding water and stuff like that. But it seems to, and again this ties into NLP, set up way of dealing with the unconscious from the point of view of referencing yes and no responses and things. And obviously if you douse, then you are setting up other, much more than just yes no responses. So if making a map is a magical art, which sort of it is, I think, because it's all to do with symbolism, where you are going is also magical, or deeply psychological. So NLP Timelines created an imagery of a map in time, past, future and present. So to discover the directionality of time, think of something that you did yesterday and where is it situated in your memory. So if you think about, yesterday you had whatever it was for lunch, where, when you think about it, is that memory? Is it behind you? If it's behind you, is it to the, For me, it's sort of sitting here somewhere as a memory. And then if you think about what you did last week, where is it? Is it, I can think about, and it's sort of on a line from here. Now, if I think about what I might be doing this afternoon, it's sort of here. So you can see that for me, there is a line. I'm not saying that everybody's at a straight line, because it might not be. But that then gives you this idea that this afternoon is sort of here, tomorrow is sort of over here, going out into the future. And that in itself creates some sort of directionality. Now, you can do all sorts of things with it. You can create another line and all sorts of stuff. And really, again, this is where your imagination can go bonkers, Now, for people who are unfamiliar with the thing about NLP, just as a sort of just a quick thing about its effectiveness and where it's used, it often goes where the money is. So it was used a lot for training sportsmen, high-end sportsmen. Andre Agassi is a good example, who sort of virtually dropped out the seedings one year, and Tony Robbins, or as he likes to call himself now, Anthony Robbins, worked with Agassi, and he got back to becoming, I think, the number one within a year, or number two, or something like that. Anyway, but it was, a ridiculous turnaround in events. So this stuff is very effective. So I'll just park that there. Okay. So the thing is, with this timeline, you can start doing things like you could create an important, if you think about it, superhero skill that appears at this point in your timeline. If you're into that type of Marvel film franchise, you could do something like that. You could have something that appears at that point. And if you don't make it too specific, but make it sort of general, something will happen, because your unconscious is looking for the things that you need. I know that sounds, but again, we're doing a thought experiment, so don't make this sort of logical. Anyway, so you can do things now, like you could walk your timeline. So if you've got a big enough space, you could imagine what the things are and literally, physically walk into the future and back into the past. And then see what happens in your thinking. Cool. So the point is, when you're walking your timeline, you need to bring in as many sensory aspects as you can. Okay? So experience the feelings of success with what you're doing, and you could do this by also going back into the past, going to times when you had something that made you feel really good, stand in that experience and sort of multiply it in your feelings, and then take it into the future. Walk with that thing. Make it something that you could envisage, as an object that you could hold. And you think about, in myths, well, even like Lord of the Rings, where Galadriel gives Frodo the light that he could use when things are very dark. That type of thing. These things are used in mythic stories all the time. So when you're walking your timeline, visualise and put the emotional data into the experience. Focus on each step of the way, with no thought to why or how something could work. That is really important. Again, referencing myths. They're illogical, aren't they? Suddenly, the fairy godmother turns up, unannounced. Nobody goes, "Who the heck are you?" You just go, "Oh, you're the fairy godmother. Thank you very much." Okay. So what you're doing with this, you're focusing on this with no thought of why or how something can work. Putting yourself into a state of the sort of in-betweenness. And let's face it, when you're doing something like this, you are definitely in between. I mean, you're walking an imaginary path that's in your mind in the physical world. That's pretty weird. So this sort of a non-attachment thing is a result, and is very, very effective. Okay, I've no scientific reason for why this stuff should work, but only from my own experience and the experience of others. So you're including the things that will happen on your journey, and you can charge things up, and I mentioned this just earlier on, by literally doubling the feeling. So an experiment here is this. If you just imagine a pile of peanuts, you can double the size of the pile of peanuts, and you can double them again in your imagination, and you can halve them. But then you can't take away 53 peanuts. And it's almost like the doubling is something that the unconscious does. But addition and subtraction isn't. That's a logical thing, somehow. I know that sounds a bit weird, but and it takes a little bit longer to explain this in detail, but things like multiplication and stuff is definitely something that the unconscious does. Okay, because you can learn it, basically. So that's really good for sort of charging up your feeling, making you more confident, whatever it is, okay? And then if you think of something that's easy to imagine, like being happy, and think of an event that happened in your life that made you happy, you can estimate the amount of happiness that you had on a scale of, say, 1 to 10. And then you can double the feeling. So you could make that, scale go up to 20 or 30, or 40 or 100 or whatever. Okay, so you can break the sort of confines of what your limitations, your paradigms are, quite easy with this. So what we've got so far is a process of mapping thinking into the future and mapping thinking in the past based on the concept of a map, and that the map is actually an interface between how the logical mind works and the complex world that we exist in. And by its very nature, a map makes things simple, which is something I didn't say earlier on. Okay, so the process is to walk the memories and place them on the timeline. And then think of some things that you're going to be doing in the future and give you some sort of trajectory. So, think about this from a creative point of view. Let's say you're going to write a book, which I obviously am, or you're going to write a song, which I do. You envisage how that's going to happen. Get that on your timeline. And then, at one of those events that's on your timeline, you create. So for instance, you're trying to get a band started. I mentioned this in how to start a rock band. Organise a gig for the future. Book the venue so you can't get out of it. Okay, so now, memory mansions I mentioned earlier. Lots of storytellers had extraordinary memories. And of course, a lot of these stories are journeys. So think about that. If you think about the Joseph Campbell thing of the hero's journey, the whole way that for instance, Hollywood is based on the hero's journey. Tarot cards are based on the hero's journey. Lots of games are based on the hero's journey, whether that's Ludo, Snakes and Ladders, or whatever. So there is something in our consciousness that's about a journey. Now, here's an interesting thing. Reverse time. And again, this is another thing which we could spend a lot of time on this one. But there is something about the concept of time. You know, logically we always think of it as a linear event. But of course, if we think about walking in a straight line, if you walked for long enough, you would come back to where you started from, because obviously we're sitting on a sphere. Now, there's a lot of theories now in quantum theory that actually time might be a sphere. So it's, you know, we're talking about hyperspheres here, right? Now, as far as we're concerned, it goes in a straight line. But what if it isn't? And it would explain a lot of other weird stuff that goes on in life and in science. So one of the ideas in quantum theory is that time draws the past and the present to itself. It's one of the explanations of how electrons in a double split aperture test know when they can become particles and all the rest of it instead of waves. So they must know where they need to be in the future. Now, once you start going down this road, it really boggles the mind. But let's just keep with something simple. If you are able to imagine an event in the future, the likelihood is that things will change to draw you to it. That's the theory. So let's use that as a thought experiment. So now we've got a few possible interesting things going on. Now, the reason I'm fascinated by this is because of what I do with songwriting and a little hypothesis that arts change the environment that they exist in by making things fit their story. And this might be the reason for stories anyway, if you go back in time, because they're a form of initiation to the young of the culture. So, for instance, when some of the initiations that happen for young warriors in traditional societies, like the Maasai and all the rest of it, go through a very painful ritual, and also to the point of facing death and pain and all the rest. There's also stories told, and they are an important aspect to this. So my little experiment, if you like, is getting people to write songs about what they want instead of "my baby left me," or "I feel so blue." Because and I've mentioned this on a number of podcasts, the bluesmen didn't do that sort of stuff very much. It was more a case, my baby left me, but her sisters, left the door open, type of thing. It's all about the sort of alchemy of change and dealing with stuff, empowering you, even when you haven't got an awful lot of power. And of course, that is the history of witchcraft in the world. At that level, it's about people who are disempowered trying to find some power. Okay, so let's sort of leave it there. Experiment with these ideas. They are very powerful psychological tools, and as I said to you, it depends on how you want to label them. Remember that Jung was deeply involved in the mystical, and he didn't want people to go too far down that route because he wanted it to science it up. Absolutely true with lots of other people involved in psychoanalysis as well. So really, psychoanalysis and the whole sort of film of the world of psychology has got more to do with the shamanic than it has to do with science. And I don't mean that to ridicule it at all, because when you're dealing with the unconscious, you're dealing with something that we just cannot understand at all. And sometimes we've got to come at it from the mythic. Well, in fact, we have got to come at it from the mythic to make sense of it. So there's a lot of things you could do with this. As I say, my viewpoint is from a view of creativity and what amazing stuff you can get happening in your life, even if it's just to make you feel happier. And hey, we need that at the moment. So on that note, I've got some great interviews coming up, and if you want to know more about the stuff that we're doing, Blues Camp, Patreon, the sort of thing about learning to play the guitar, learning to sing, and all that stuff, songwriting, and all the rest of it. Contact me, send me some stuff through Patreon. You can easily get to me by just going to Patreon and /Vic Heinert. And until next time, see you then.